Good afternoon, my name is Daniela, and today I'm going to be talking about Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, particularly about race and racism that's deeply engraved in the book. First, I think it's important to recognize the historical context behind Heart of Darkness, which it was written and published in 1899, right before the rise of the civil rights movement in the United States, which was a period when African Americans were struggling for equality and justice in the face of systematic oppression. The novel was published during an era when colonialism was still uncontrolled, and while we may look at this period through a modern lens, or like a 21st century lens, we can't ignore the vast divide between the ideologies of the far-right colonial powers and the growing calls for social change. Heart of Darkness does very little to bridge this gap. In fact, I think it does the exact opposite, and it presents a view of race that is in many ways more harmful and troubling and problematic. Some may argue that Heart of Darkness is merely a product of its time, and I do acknowledge that the 19th century perspective is a lot less progressive than today. But I don't think that's an excuse for the way that Conrad portrays the African characters in this novel. In fact, I believe that Heart of Darkness is inherently racist because of the way Conrad dehumanizes and discriminates against the African people and reduces them to symbols of darkness, savagery, and chaos. The central issue with Conrad's portrayal of Africans in their near total lack of individuality, and they're often depicted as faceless subhumans, and quote-unquote from the book, others, existing as kind of like only a backdrop of the European characters. In the novel, African workers on the Belgian Congo plantation are referred to as pilgrims, and that's like a term that reflects their subordinate position and removes any agency that they might have, and these characters serve as merely symbols of quote-unquote darkness that the European characters, particularly Kurt's, are trying to conquer. And it's almost like their voices are absent, and they're presented as only silent figures and kind of existing only to highlight the European characters. This is also one of the literary devices that Conrad uses in his book, and it's the metaphor and concept of darkness, which serves both as physical and symbolic representation of the African continent in a negative light. Another literary device that Conrad uses is dehumanizing diction when describing the natives. For instance, Marlowe, the novel's protagonist, refers to the African natives in the jungle as wild, savage, or even cannibalistic. These words are not just descriptors, but they serve to dehumanize them, and he's using them in a negative way, casting them as dangerous or untamed creatures, which they are not. It's merely like a perspective and mindset that Marlowe clearly has. One example is when Marlowe describes the African helmsman on the boat as, quote-unquote, he had the pose of a wild beast, and it was too much for me. I looked at him, and he was quite near me, and with his wild beast-like posture and the desperate look in his eyes, in that scene, the African helmsman is reduced to an animalistic figure, and he's stripped of all of his humanity and individuality, and is portrayed as a symbol or perceived as wild and unpredictable. This depiction is not just an isolated incident. That throughout the entire book, the African landscape is painted as threatening and just uncontrollable. In contrast, European characters like Marlowe are portrayed as inline figures, which is, again, evidence towards this gap that Conrad has made between the European characters and the African characters. But however, this idea of enlightenment is juxtaposed with the hypocrisy and brutality of European colonization. Marlowe himself, while critical of the horrors he witnesses, never fully rejects the racist attitudes. He frames himself as someone who has seen the truth of imperialism, but he still holds on to colonial notions of the superiority of Europeans. This is particularly evident when he refers to the Europeans as pilgrims again. That the idea or term evokes a sense of righteousness and moral superiority. So he definitely has a superiority complex, despite their violence and exploitation. He reflects the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much, quote unquote, from Marlowe. So in conclusion, Heart of Darkness is not just a critique on colonialism, but it's by the virtue of its portrayal of race, it's also a manifestation of colonial thought itself. So with all this said, I truly believe that Heart of Darkness is a racist book. Thank you.